Okay, let's take a look at Cortez. This is a command game supplement. I don't know if this comes separate from the magazine, but it contains some magazine aspects. For example, these, well, you have designer's notes, great. But it also, the schedule of further games, which makes it look like this is just the magazine itself. Advertising. This is not built into the rules, but there's no easy way to separate the rules. Feedback results. This looks like a strategy guide for this particular game. So, and a little bit of playthrough. And then a little bit of, well, some classified ads and variants and errata. Very interesting format compared to, say, the S&T format, which really, you know, puts the game in the magazine. The magazine is a standalone magazine that somebody might want to have. This, I can't imagine, but it specifically says game supplement, so I'm assuming maybe there are command magazines that aren't. This is XTR. I've heard good things about XTR. Unfortunately, one of the first things that comes to mind in this game is Ty Bomba is talking about, yeah, don't worry, this is a good game. I know it doesn't have Panzers in it, which leads me to believe that most XTR games are probably World War II and therefore not too interesting to me. But this one is a very interesting subject. In particular, I tried to write a game, not on this, which is actually the siege and assaults on I guess Tenochtitlan, but I can't pronounce that. What became Mexico City? It's such an interesting city, actually, because the Aztecs drained a swamp, making it into lakes and some drier land, although we do have somewhere or another a quagmire. I don't know where that is. I hope I'm not in it. Oh, there it is. A hex which is neither really water nor dry land. It is more the swamp, and that's actually just impassable. That's more what this whole area was before the Aztecs came. But the game that I was trying to design was more the entirety of Cortez's conquest, including, you know, having to convince his own troop. Well, the Spaniards who came to arrest him to join him on the operation and everything, but also including exploration aspects. Mainly because Cortez's conquest of Mexico always struck me as an unbelievable story, in a way that some people look at Pizarro's expedition as even more impressive. You know, it didn't impress me as much in the sense of a set of unlikely happenings. Very clearly, Pizarro had, first of all, he had more troops on his own, and then he also was able to incite strife in various strange sort of ways. Now, Cortez did the same kind of thing, but it just, the numbers and the unfamiliarity. There were no real rumors except maybe of the Chinese fleet or something, because you know, they were accepted almost as gods at points. All that would very much interest me, and the closest thing I have to touching on that is part of, I'm looking, and I'm not seeing. Part of the Tim Jim game, I'm trying very hard to recall, and I just don't see it in my stuff. Oh, there it is, Age of Exploration. And I've done a video on that. I should get back to that, because it actually, I played it with my wife, and it's not as painful as I was having a hard time with it. Okay, but the rules are horrible, as in many Tim Jim games. So let's get to what's going on here. This is an assault on the city itself. And the goal for the Spaniards, well, they have two goals. One is to drive all the Aztecs out of Tenochtitlan. The other is they have to keep their loss points low. And loss points are sort of a factor not only of how viable the Cortez's force will still be for a further conquest, but also what the impression on the Aztecs themselves and on the other on Cortez's allies and other neutral nations in the Mexico area, all of which was an important factor to the swift conquest, was how quickly they were willing to give in once the Aztecs were conquered. And I suppose they just didn't realize what the real stakes of the war were. All right. So our units are, let's look at the units first. Our units are pretty simple. They have 4 numbers on them. Combat strength, movement, great. This is the number of steps in the unit, and this is a numerical indicator. Now that numerical indicator will get you to the names of the different units, but it also tracks you to these step reduced units. So some of these units are elite units that have 4 steps on them, and they're going to have a replacement counter for them. Casualties are handled a little oddly in this, so let's keep working on it. And obviously on the back side of a unit you have its first step reduction, and if it has more step reductions, they come further. You have different kinds of units. The Aztecs have Aztec units, some of which are the elite units, but they are all assumed to have boats in play. We also have a couple of leaders, some guy, Cotomac, something like that, and Cortes here, and they have an effect. The Spaniards have these gunboats, which are terrifyingly strong. I was thinking about challenging them at first, but when I realized just how big that stack is, those are 20 points each. Most of the units in the game are, 4 or 5 points. It would take a humongous stack to face that, because that is a fairly big stack. Now, on the bright side for the Aztecs, those things can't go on land. They'd be tanks then. All right. For the Spaniards, they have native allies who will be recorded with an indicator of what nationality they are. They can only stack with one another. We'll get to what the stacking limitations are of their own alliance. And some of these native allies will have a little blue number for their movement. That means they're canoe capable. They can go out in the water if they want. Yeah, we'll get to the water in a moment. For the Spaniards, they have their standard Spanish infantry, and then they also have some Spanish cavalry, which you can see is pretty potent. Underneath that, they have artillery, which provides a modifier to combat. Okay. For the board itself, you have kind of this dry land region. You have Chinampa City. This is city that's been turned from the swamps, and it would be it's very easy for the Aztecs to defend this, just because the terrain is so bad underneath. They can do damage to the terrain. They can there's canals and crap going through it that they know like the backs of their hand, and they can defend it very well. You also have different kinds of fortifications, and those come in multiple levels: regular fortress and major fortress. There's a couple of counters I'm missing. I think they were thrown away by whoever sold me the game. They're for the advanced game, and we'll be playing with that. They're for human sacrifice and temple desecration. All I need is 2 counters, and these are just really reminder counters that certain actions have taken place. So it's not really, they're not really vital to the game that I want to make something for them, but they're not vital that they're missing. So I don't feel too badly about that. The map is well worn. It's also kind of cheaply made, so it may get well worn pretty easily. I've seen some games get worn pretty badly without much play. I was going to say somebody probably played it a lot, but if you look at the counters, they're not very worn, so I don't think there was a lot of play on this. They're actually very pretty. This is an early 90s game. People were just beginning to come up with this, hey, let's make the counters look like just people. You know, the fighting men, the soldiers. And, you know, the printing quality had gotten to the point where they could do color artwork like that and do a good job on it. And this is one of the earlier examples I've seen of that. Maharaja's another one. You also have these temples, which are what the desecration and human sacrifice markers are for. And you have some little land-based cities here. You notice there's a fortification here, which is somewhat important to the game. And then we have this weirdness, these water areas. Wow, that reminds me of Remember the Main for some reason, just the area water map. And we have these causeways. Now the causeways are things you can fight on and move through on land, but the boats can also sail through them because there's arches and such now. All right. The base turn sequence in the game is pretty simple. The Spanish player moves first on the lake and then at land, whatever. There's not going to be any transportation of Spanish troops. Those gunboats can only carry Cortes at the most. Then they get a combat and shore bombardment. After any naval combat, if any units were withheld or didn't fight in the naval combat, they're allowed to do a shore bombardment attack, which is kind of cool. And then the Aztecs have a similar, in fact, exactly the same sequence of play, including the lake bombardment. Oh, I forgot about ground combat. Yeah, after the lake combat, you do ground combat. And there's the possibility the Spaniard at any time can call his attack off. Now, for the most part, this is his decision. He loses 5 loss points, or he takes 5 loss points for this. And he doesn't want to take loss points. That's a big hit. Basically, if he does that twice, it puts him out of the most successful victory that's possible. If he decides to declare that he's going to break off, the Aztecs have the option to deny that. If they took captives during the immediately preceding combat phase, if there's 1 or more Spanish units on a causeway or Tenochtitlan, or if there's 1 or more Aztecs on non-causeway hexes completely outside Tenochtitlan, for example here, they can compete. And the setup was very free for the Aztecs. The Spaniards had to set up within 2 hexes of these starting hexes with numbers in them. But setup for the Aztecs was pretty much 4 hexes away from the Spaniards or in any water areas that aren't on the east edge of the map. So I could have set up to try to launch an attack over here or something. I'm looking more towards a defensive positioning because making an attack might be very risky and probably won't gain me much. But this fortress seemed important for a number of reasons. Okay. If the Aztec then rolls a die, if he's allowed to challenge, he rolls a die and he adds the number of full-strength knight units on the map at that instant. Now, knights are, I believe, all these multi-step units that they have. They look kind of like this. But basically, they'll be the guys with 4 steps or with an asterisk on the other side. If he's just rolling 1 die, if he gets a 12 or more, the Spanish player doesn't get his R&R option. Now, the Aztecs can also win the game by killing Cortes. The feeling here, or the idea here, is Cortes was such an important individual in this situation that the whole thing would have fallen apart without him. And, you know, you kind of tend to agree that wow, it's hard to believe any man, any troops could have survived and prospered in this situation the way they did. And you've got to lay the blame on something. Other Spanish expeditions with quality fortune seekers did not do anything this impressive in certain circumstances. So you got to lay some of the blame on Cortez's own ability to play upon his men. All right. So LPs, these are the loss points. You lose 5. You get 5 of them every time you call a recuperation phase. And in fact, you can string multiple recuperation phases together if you like, but they each cost you 5. You lose 1 for every unit currently in the dead pile. Units will recuperate, however. You lose 5 if Cotamoc was not captured or killed at some point during the game. So if you win the game, if you finish the city off but you let him escape, then he'll be a force that'll oppose you in the rest of the conquest. And he's a good general. And then we have the different levels of victory. Basically, the historical is going to be in this 9 to 16 area, and you want to do better than that as the Spaniards, if you can. The Aztec victories, pretty much any of them, don't indicate that the Aztecs will survive this. Even the complete victory of killing Cortez, you know, the honest fact is they were doomed in the end. It's just how bloody a war would it be? And there could be some question if Cortez did not conquer Tenochtitlan. Well, then would it be possible that the Spaniards would have eventually come into an almost nation-state understanding of the Aztecs and been able to conduct diplomacy on them directly? Maybe. You certainly saw that in some other areas, not with an empire of this size, but where the natives were allowed to maintain their nationhood, at least for some significant amount of time, just because they were too tough to fight. All right, stacking. So the Spaniards are allowed to stack up to 5 of their regular units. Cannons and Cortes don't count against stacking. I've already talked about the Spanish can't stack with the natives. Now, natives are kind of weird. For the most part, you can't stack regular native infantry, but you can stack their elites or knights or whatever. 1 elite or knight with 1 regular unit. In addition, the Aztec stacking allows them to put 3 knights together if there's nothing else there. That could be quite a potent force if you have one place you want to fight. In the lake areas, there's no limits. Alright, movement points, pretty standard. You're going to be moving through the terrain at the terrain effects cost. So unfortunately, there's a little chart embedded in the rules, and I'd kind of like to photocopy this, but I'm not going to be looking through the rules too much, so I don't think I will. You have different movement costs here, where a number of things costs 2. In particular, the causeways are cheap for the Aztecs, but they're going to break them up and cause problems in them in a way that they have engineering capabilities that, quite simply, the Spaniards didn't. So they're considered able to repair those causeways with great ease if they're damaged, and to break them up and cause problems to the Spaniards. In terms of combat factors, you'll see a regular city gives a shift 1 to the left, but the Aztecs get a bonus in the Chinampa cities, and then the fortresses and the temple complexes give bonuses as well. Causeways don't give a direct defensive bonus, but they do force the Spanish to only attack with 1 unit across those causeways. Now, given that the Spanish are allowed to stack 5 units, that's a pretty major advantage to defending the causeways. I don't know if it's enough. You got to assume the Spaniards, with their big cav, can kind of fight their way through, and we'll look at special rules about that. You got your normal odds chart. What you're going to be doing is rolling 2 dice, and the results are expressed as losses to the attacker in steps, losses to the defender in steps. You got a big span of odds here, and obviously we have some shifts. They go through a lot of work to tell you how to calculate odds. It's all pretty simple there. The Spanish player is not allowed to look under the Aztec units. The Aztec player is allowed to look at everything on the board. However, if his 2 temples are desecrated, because they're the high points, he was using these as a means to get a good vantage point to view everything. If those are both desecrated, he can't do that anymore. He's restricted to not being able to peek. A lot of stuff that's on those charts is spelled out here. Okay, if the defender hex is vacated in combat, at least one surviving attacking unit must be moved into that hex. You have to press forward because you're meleeing, essentially. You may move more in. Victorious defenders do not advance. Okay, the cannon. That increases the damage to the Aztecs in any fight that it's involved in by 1. An extra step. Restrictions on the causeway. Lake combat is one big combat in the lake area. So most combat is not mandatory. Lake combat is. If you're in the same area in a lake area as your enemy, you must attack them. And to tell you the truth, the Aztecs kind of want to stay away from Cortez's little gunboat fleet, if it's all together, certainly. Even though I have these huge stacks here, they're mainly crappy units for the reason that crappy units aren't too useful on land, but they're perfectly fine here. If I had a lot of area to cover, I'd want lots of crappy units, but as it is, those are just bad on land, decent in water because they can stack in unlimited numbers there. Okay, shore bombardment, I didn't really explain this, but basically you're able to fire each unit that doesn't get involved in combat from a lake location. Now, Aztec and Indian allies will hit, you roll per unit, 1 die per unit, will hit only on a 1, but gunboats will hit on a 1 through 3. And they're going to cause step losses to the target hex that they're shooting at. Cortes and Cuauhtémoc have abilities. Cuauhtémoc can't leave Tenochtitlan. Yeah, at least I can kind of try to pretend if I read it. Until both the temple hexes have been desecrated at least once at some point in the game, and there are 5 or fewer Aztec units left on the island. Basically, the island has to look like it's going to fall for him to run. Cortes, if he's stacked with if Cuauhtémoc is stacked with a force of attacking Aztec units, the attack gets 2 columns shift in its bonus. He's good at attacking. Cortes, on the other hand, if he's stacked with any Spanish unit involved in combat, now this I think is a typo, that defense receives a 1 column shift in the Spanish favor. I would say either direction, on attack and defense, Cortes gives a 1 column shift. Alright, it's possible, since it's a victory condition, to kill or capture a leader. If a leader is stacked with units that were eliminated, now I assume that's the entire stack is eliminated, again, not really hammered down, and by the errata section in this rule book, in the back of this rule book, I'm assuming there's a decent amount in all XTR games. It looks like a few issues of significance. Not a lot of typos, though. The opposing player rolls 2 dice. If the roll is a 7, the leader's captured or killed. If the roll is anything else, the leader gets away. If either leader is stacked with units that take one or more step losses in combat, but some units survive, the opposing player rolls 2 dice. On a 12, the leader's captured or killed. So this is a risky thing to use Cortez in battle. I would try to avoid it, actually. If his leader contributes his value to an attack, then it's... and the attackers suffer no casualties, he's captured on a 2. If the attackers suffer casualties, both are combined, so he will be eliminated on a 2 or 12. Once Cotamak is free to leave Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs can move him off the map board. It's got to be a land hex on the west or southern end, and he has to pay a movement point. It's here, or over there. And there's a bonus to this. You get him off the map, you no longer have him as an advantage, but it means that the Spaniards can no longer kill him. So they're taking, what, I think it was 5-point loss for not killing him. And if they do an R&R, well, right there, they're out of the top victory condition. Yep. So far, there's nothing too exciting here. You know, it looks like a fairly simple war game, but it gets more interesting. This is the R&R phase. Whenever this is done, the first thing that happens is you check to see if the Spanish Indian allies desert. And based on what's going on, human sacrifice markers subtract 1. The Aztec player exiting 1 unit raid, it's an optional rule, during that last combat era will get will cause a -1. If the Aztec attempted to abort his declaration, that causes a penalty, even though he failed here. The simple fact that the Aztecs were in the position to and attempted to oppose ending the combat causes the natives to want to leave. It kind of makes sense. And then if the Aztecs are holding Chapultepec, that causes a big penalty, not being able to take that out. Now, if you roll less than a 1 on the modified, all the non-elite Indian allies leave the board, and they don't go into the dead pile. The elite units don't desert, and they'll return back to play at full strength in the next R&R phase. Now that sounds kind of like, that's not so big a deal. Well, maybe it is. Here's why. You have to pay 5 of your loss points for each R&R. So if they desert you, that means you want them back, you got to pay another R&R. Another big hit on victory points. How useful are they? Well, they're kind of crappy units, but they're going to help hold your flanks and defend you a little bit. Force the Aztecs to spend effort attacking them so that they can get reasonable odds against the Spanish units. Then both players are going to redeploy, and basically they pull their units off the map. Now, if units are surrounded, they'll end up dying from that. The Spaniards are allowed to keep their positions in these major fortresses on the coast as well as on this one, but no other fortresses can they hold on to, including Chapultepec. And he can deploy additional units there, and he can deploy along the causeway going to the fortress if he owns it. Then after the Spanish player replaces his units, the Aztec will be removing his from the map. He may leave them at Chapultepec or Akanago, which is this one. And then he's got to redeploy his forces into any Tenochtitlan hexes, excepting the coastal fortresses. The Spaniard can go on to any non-Tenochtitlan land hexes, plus any forts and causeways that he's gathered, and his gunboats go off on the east edge. Okay. After both sides have redeployed their forces, each rolls a die for every unit that's less than full strength, and you get a chance of getting them back. The regular Indian units come back on a 1 to 2. Spanish or allied elites come back up to 2 steps on a roll of 1 and 1 step on a 2 through 4. Aztec knights come back on a 1 through 3, 1 step. Then you roll for each of your dead units to see if they reform, and they come back possibly at full or reduced strength, again by die roll. And then these get redeployed on the map. There's a disease check if we're using that rule, which we will, but I'll get to that in a moment. And then the Spaniard has the option to call another R&R phase. So you get some troops back, but both sides do. As to the options, the Aztecs can raid off map after the first, in each movement phase, after the first R&R interphase. The Aztec player can move a full strength regular unit off the map sheet, and that'll increase the probability the allies leave. They have these trapping tactics. Okay, so this is kind of cool. The Aztecs and the Spanish Cav have special tactics each. So the trapping tactics requires a knight to be involved. And you spring a trap on the Spanish or Indian allies. You indicate the unit you're trying to trap. You roll a die for each knight, and on a 6, you suck it into the trap. You're allowed to retreat your knight, and that unit has to follow you. Then you are allowed to attack it off on its own, or, well, and also you can attack other units in the now weakened stack. So it's kind of a cool option there. You can take casualties to improve your chance of a trap working. The Cav charge, if the Spaniards want to attack with Cav, they can improve their combat situation by charging the Aztecs. They indicate the defending units are stacked they're charging, roll a die for each Cav unit. On a 5 or 6, if the Aztec contain knights, or 3 through 6 if they don't, the charge will succeed, and an Aztec unit is reduced by 1 step, and the Spanish player moves it 1 hex in any direction. Then the charging Cav must occupy the hex, and any other Spanish units with the Cav can do so. Cannon can only move if transported by Spanish infantry. If they're caught, I didn't think cannon were an optional rule. If they're caught alone, they're destroyed. And they increase the losses by 1 for the Aztecs, either attack or defense. If the Spanish lose steps in battle in which Aztec knights participated as the defender, the Spaniards are the defender, you roll a die on a 1 or 2. The knights have taken some prisoners to be sacrificed. You put in a human sacrifice marker on one of the temple complexes. If the second prisoner is taken, the second human sacrifice goes there. For every human sacrifice counter on the map, the Aztec attack odds are increased by 1 column right. So they get a shift in their favor attacking. It stays until the start of the next R&R interphase, or until the temple is desecrated. If still more prisoners are taken after the sacrifice counters are deployed, there's no further effect. This also, any prisoners taken affects the Allies' defection table. So even if the counter's not on the map because the temple's been desecrated, you still might get a penalty on your allies. So you gotta kind of remember that. If the Spanish infantry is stacked, this is temple desecration. If Cortes and Spanish infantry or any cavalry even without Cortez. Enters a temple complex hex, and there's only 2 of them on the map. A desecrated marker goes on the board. That will get rid of the human sacrifice marker bonuses from that temple. It stays that way until the next R&R interphase. They cannot perform human sacrifices. And I think that's the only effect there. Optional Fog of War. This is what I went over with the temples. If both temples are desecrated, the Aztec can no longer look at the Spaniards. Disease. An earlier outbreak of smallpox is already in the game with the Aztec capabilities. However, both sides are sometimes affected by other illnesses. So, at the last step in every R&R, the Aztec player rolls 2 dice. If he gets a 2 or 12, a disease is broken out. Spanish player rolls a die and reduces his on-map forces by that number of steps. The Aztec player rolls 2 dice and reduces his forces by that number of steps. And that is it. You know, I mean, it looks like an interesting tactical situation with these causeways, with the lake implications, strange combat units and everything. Everything about it is kind of neat that way. And then add on to that this R&R procedure. And it looks very, very interesting to me at this point. We'll see how it plays out. But it's gotten good ratings, so I assume it's kind of held up fairly well at least. All right, let's send this up.